Well, we're at about that point where we're going to start pulling the rear end off of this one, which I just noticed does have ABS. So I'll probably change that sensor since I know this one works. And here is how that emergency brake system needs to be set up. So I need to disconnect the cable from that little thing, pull this one through here, pull that one through there, save my spring, and everything else is going to be all right. After that, it's drive shaft, shocks, brake line, ABS plug, and U-bolts. That's about it. So we're going to get on with that. You saw how everything came apart in the last video, so we're going to skip some of this stuff because it's exactly the same as the donor. Well, it's out. Didn't fight me too bad. Here are the stickers. On mine. This is actually the ratio code, 3.55, 9.75. So this is the tag that wasn't on that rear end. It had this one though, weirdly. They didn't put the important one back, but they put the one for the oil. But just as a reference, let's see if we can roll this over without dropping it on myself. You remember the other one. No slop. Nice and smooth. And see if we can get this to sit like that. One of the things I'm going to do is now put my little inch-pound torque wrench on this thing and hook it to this and spin it to see how much torque this thing actually takes to spin, because that's part of the setup for that pinion gear. So we're going to go get some a pad and some paper and a pen and then start taking some measurements. I got my trusty inch-pound torque wrench. And I think the factory spec is like 15. And it's going to take a little doing. Alright, so we got about 12-ish, which is pretty good, considering this thing has 285,000 miles on it. So we're going to mark that down. And if we struggle getting to the factory spec when we're resetting the pinion, then I'll go with what I have there, because I know that currently works. So now we're going to pop the back off of this thing, drain the oil, and start pulling the center section out. Okay, so we got the back off. About to do the same thing we did to the other one. You got to pull this pin, push the axles in, pull the C-clips, pull the axles out, then we can take the caps off, take this off. And while we were doing that, spinning the old rear end around and happened to notice 355.
That's what it is.
And we just counted them, and it's 39 and 11. So that is a 355 gear set. So this, as I suspected, given that weird sticker, this is not the original rear end out of that truck. So possibly, again, when it was totaled and the bed was changed and that right spring had to be changed out, they had to change the rear end out. They couldn't get a 373 cheap, so they went with the 355. So this was the same gears as I needed, but as we showed, the pinion on this one is a hell of a lot nicer than that. So we're about to start taking this apart and taken some measurements so I can understand how I need to reset that pinion. So there's that. So we got the axles out. They are different, smaller bearings on the ends as you might expect, but the same number of splines and same length, so I'll be able to use the axles that came with it. That's no issue there. The next thing we're going to do, I'm going to set the camera up. We're going to pop these bearing caps off. Actually, I should put that pin back in just to make sure nothing flies out of there, because I need to save this. We'll put that pin back in, pop these bearing caps off, pry this out, and then I'm going to measure these shims to see if they're the same as the other shims that came off of that rear end. Because if that's the case, that's going to make a statement about how Ford sets its tolerances up as far as how these things were originally built. That they're not done by hand, they just know that the manufacturing tolerances are X, their acceptable tolerances for running the gears are Y, and that everything else is just, if I put this, XYZ shim in with no other measurement, everything works. But if they're different, that's where it's going to get a little interesting. So, here we go. Alright, so the shims that came out of the old, or the new, rear end are 265 thousandths. Alright.
And 261.
Oh, they were different? Uh-huh. So we had 265 on the right and 261 on the left.
I didn't think they did.
Interesting. Well, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it just...
Makes sense, because that...
Yeah, it gives the right amount of side play.
Yep. So there is something to be said for that. So those are right off. Well, bearings are nice and clean, which is good. Now I need my pry bar, because this thing is, these are snug. And it's really not too bad. Yeah. There she goes. There she goes. Alright.
247.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Alright.
This one's much bigger. 277.
Wow. Okay. So that's what we're going to put back in the other one. So that's interesting. So they are set per the actual rear end.
Oh yeah.
Interesting. I mean, that makes sense. Yep, that makes sense. I'm just, it's interesting. So we'll take that out of there, set it down here, set this one. Although now I have kind of a quandary. Given the housing and the fact that it was a 355 gear set in that other housing, should I use the shims that came with that housing? I'm going to start with, I think I'm going to start with the shims that came out of that housing. Just because that's probably the difference. But,
Alright, bearings are the same.
yeah, according to everything I found, all the bearings were exactly the same. So. Okay, so now we have to check the pinion depth, which is set with shims between the big bearing and the pinion itself. And I really don't want to change those, if I don't have to. So we need to measure from some fixed surface here down to this, and make sure that what we have in there is within a couple of thousandths of that. So we're going to try to do that now. For 515 thousandths. Alright. So we're going to be shooting for somewhere, I would say, on this corner, when it's in, with the Ford sign pointing the way that is, of about 510 to 515.
But that's not machined, so it's...
No, and that's not a machine surface, but that's what you're supposed to do, is measure down to that. So this isn't perfect. I don't know how you're supposed to do that properly. Interesting. But, so that's what we're going to shoot for when we get that pinion in the other rear end, which is actually going to be the next step. So now we're going to flip it over, pull that nut off, pop the seal out, pull the pinion out, and transfer it over to the other machine, other housing, and see what we come up with. You can really see the difference now in the size of the bearings on this front. Very, very different setup. So now we're going to pop this seal out so we can get the shim out of there, because there is a shim. And then we're going to try to set it up in there and see what we got. Alright, so we've run up against an issue, as the depth where the pinion crush sleeve goes on the 97 pinion is about 3/8 of an inch higher than where it goes on the 03 pinion, or whatever the hell this is. So without some machine work, this gear will not go, because it will not allow the bearings to come together enough in the new housing. So I'm going to do something that you shouldn't do, but because I don't care, is I'm going to use the old gear, which is in pretty good shape, in the old housing, with the little shim here that came off of the 97, because it's exactly the same thickness as the other one, just not screwed up. And then we're going to set that in. We checked the depth a second ago, and it's very close to what the actual 97 was, even with these shims. So I'm assuming that that's going to be good, since it's the same piece that came out. We're going to put that in, snug it down, try to get the torque where it's supposed to be. And then I'm going to end up reusing these shims with this housing, but that other center section with the good gear on it, to put everything back together. And if my backlash ends up too bad, I'll just pop the shitty gear off of the carrier that came in this, and I will reuse it. But I'd really like to use my own parts if I can, because I know that I just rebuilt those other ones. So I got this in here, I got that bearing lubed up with some assembly lube, and now I'm going to put the seal in, and then I'm going to try to install the pinion. Yes, that's not too screwed up, which is nice. So, okay. Assembly lube works.
Yeah.
There she goes. Zip her down a little bit. Have to pull up on it. Okay. All right. So now I've got to tighten that up until it's snug.
A full turn, probably.
So I'm going to just snug it up.
A lot easier than I thought it would.
Yeah, me too. All right. That's pretty damn good. Feels generally pretty smooth. Now we'll get the old inch-pound torque wrench.
It's 50. Wow.
Yeah, but the middle there's 25, and
Yeah, you're going, what, 15, 20?
it's about 15. I'd go a little bit more, I think. And then we're going to go actually check what it's supposed to be. But I believe it is between like 19 and 25.
Look pretty stiff.
That is right at about 25. I'm going to go confirm that that's okay, because that is a little stiffer than it used to be, but I'm going to go check that and be right back. Alright, checking on the hopefully correct interwebs. That tension is supposed to be rotating at 16 to 29 inch-pounds, and we've got 25, which feels pretty darn good. A little tighter than one that came out of my axle was, but again, mine had been running for a long time. So that piece is finished. Now we're going to try to get silly and install my carrier out of the 97 into whatever year housing this silly thing is, and see if we can make everything work. Let me get it up. Alright, that's a little filthier than I'd hoped, but it'll all get flushed. So this one goes like that, and this one is not going to work. I don't think that's going to work. I think they're a different width than the other one. Yeah. This is going to be way too tight. Yeah, there's no way. Alright, okay, that's not going to work. So,
one of the others?
Well,
Pull both out?
I'm going to pull both out. Yeah.
Accelerate.
Yep. I don't think that's gonna work.
With a little hammer.
I don't really want to hammer it. I'm gonna try to pick this whole thing straight up. See if you can get that to set more equal with the bearing. Nope. Not gonna work.
Let me start measuring.
Well, the thing is, what that's telling me is, from a position standpoint, it's going to be different. It's not going to match that ring gear, the pinion. So I'm going to have to pull this gear off and reuse the other carrier, is what I'm going to have to do. That's the only way this is going to work. I'm going to have to literally put the whole thing back together with its own parts, because I don't have the spacers that I need to make this right and get all the lash correct. So, okay, could you set one of those down over here? Okay. Well, that was what I was afraid of. The housings are very different from a dimensional standpoint, and I am not going to get my old housing in here without machining some shims. And since I'm already mixing and matching gears, to hell with it. So I'm going to take the gear off of my housing, hope it's the same as the 355 off the original one, swap that, and then try this again with the original factory shim.